One of the most pleasant duties of the chair of this society is to present on behalf of the Board of Trustees from time to time the society's highest honor, the John Fitzgerald Kennedy Medal. By vote of the Board of Trustees, originally in 1964, the medal is awarded from, and I quote, "from time to time to persons who have rendered distinguished service to the cause of history. It will be the highest award the Society can confer, and it will not be limited to any field of history or, in fact, to any particular kind of service to history." President Kennedy himself would have been a highly eligible first recipient. Past recipients have been Samuel Eliot Morrison in 1967, Dumas Malone in 1972, Thomas Boylston Adams in 1976, Oscar Handlin in 1991, Edmund Morgan in 2002, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 2006, and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich in 2009. You get a sense of the distinguished recipients. To introduce this year's honoree, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ted Widmer, a Fellow of the Society, a member of the Kennedy Medal Committee, and the Director and Librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. The Brown Library, like our society, is an independent research library for the study of history and the humanities, and we are proud that one of our trustees is a member of its Board of Governors, Fred Ballou. Since our honoree is also a library governor and a member of the Brown faculty, it's very fitting that Ted should introduce him. Ted.
Thank you, Bill. I bring you all greetings from the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, where I am a resident and Gordon Wood also is a resident. There's an ancient belief here in Boston that culture withers as you head to the south and get past the great blue hill from which Massachusetts derives its name. There may be a faint pulse around Attleboro, and then no signs of life whatsoever when you get to the Rhode Island border. And I'm here to argue against that belief, and Exhibit A in my argument is the career of Gordon Wood, who is the Alva O Professor Emeritus at Brown University. Gordon is a good friend, and in fact I saw him at lunch today in Providence, and he did not know I would be at this event. So I want to choose my words carefully because I introduce him frequently. And in fact, last Friday we had our annual meeting, and having served on the committee that bestowed this high honor upon Gordon Wood, I was alarmed that Gordon hadn't received a similar award in his home precinct. So I lobbied our Board of Governors, and we secretly awarded Gordon Wood the John Carter Brown Medal last Friday, and I really wanted to be able to award it to him on our home turf before presenting it to him, the John F. Kennedy Medal to him here tonight. My own love of colonial history goes back, as Gordon knows, to when I was 15 years old, when my father was on the faculty at Brown, and he urged, or more or less insisted, that I take a course being given on American colonial history at Brown University by a very distinguished, already very distinguished Brown faculty member in the late 70s, and that was my introduction to college-level history. And I didn't know how to take notes properly, and I tried to write every word that he spoke, including of, the, and, which is no way to take notes in a college lecture class, but learned an immense amount from Gordon, and I'd never stopped learning from him. He was instrumental in my return to Providence when I became director of the John Carter Brown Library in 2006, and we've done many, many things together. He serves as an ex officio member of our board, and serves more than what is expected of most board members. He really serves on a daily basis. He's the chairman of our faculty liaison committee. plays a very active role in selecting the fellows who animate the intellectual scene at the John Carter Brown Library. I could read to you a roster of his many publications. I think you know most of them: The Creation of the American Republic, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer, and a dizzying flurry over the last 5 years or so, collections of his essays, essays about the writing of history, and yet in no sense is Gordon going into any sunset. I think retirement has only quickened the pace of his writing and his research, and much of his research has taken place in these hallowed precincts. He works often with the staff of the Adams Papers. He's the editor of the Adams Papers in the Library of America, and he's a dedicated fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And even while in Providence, we often do talk of history as it is interpreted in Boston. And the reality of these two states is they've grown quite old, quite happily together, adjacent to each other. So in that spirit, I'm really delighted to introduce the recipient of this year's John F. Kennedy Medal, Professor Gordon Wood of Brown University.
Well, thank you very much. This is a little overwhelming. Thank you, Ted, for that very generous introduction. Ted was, I think, maybe a sophomore in high school when he took this course, and he got a straight A. So it was no problem teaching him. I'm simply deeply honored to be the recipient of this John F. Kennedy Medal, and I extend my thanks to the Board of Trustees for presenting it to me. When I look at the list of the previous recipients of this prestigious award, I'm especially humbled. I began my career really as a historian in this building. I was a graduate student, first-year graduate student, and I had Professor Frank Friedel seminar, and Frank was a kind of a laissez-faire professor. He's in research teaching. In his teaching, he said to the group of us, "Why don't you just go to the Mass Historical Society and dig around in the papers, and your seminar paper will emerge." And so we did, and I came and I started with the Andrew papers, the papers of John F. Andrew, who was the son of the former Civil War governor, who was a mugwump. And there were a bunch of mugwumps whose papers were here. And so I went from his papers to the Russell papers, and then to several other papers of people who had deposited them here. And this was my first year in graduate school, and I emerged with my first publication, the Massachusetts Mugwumps, it was called. It was published in the New England Quarterly in 1960. So this is over 50 years ago. So, and it began here. So this place has a special place in my heart because of that. I also have, as Ted mentioned, I'm deeply indebted to the Adams Papers, to Jim Taylor and the staff, because they've been helping me do the Library of America volumes, which are selections of Adams's letters in a reduced number of volumes. You may have seen the others. He's the last founder to be done, but Jefferson only has one volume, Franklin only has one volume, Washington only has one volume. John Adams is going to get 4. He would be delighted to know that. But the first 2 volumes have been published. They were easy to do because I could draw on the letterpress editions which the Adams Papers had published up to 1783. But the next 2 volumes, taking him from 1784 to his death, as you know, those papers, for the most part, have not yet been published. And I'm drawing on the help of the Adams Papers project, and with Jim Taylor and his staff's help, they're actually transcribing some of the manuscripts into at least typescripts, so I can read those. So I'm deeply indebted to them. I also want to thank my wife, Louise, for all her help through my whole career. I couldn't have done it without her. And she's my editor-in-chief. And so anything that I've written is deeply indebted to her help. Now, the one thing that these previous recipients of this distinguished award have in common is that all of them were or are academic historians who wrote or write for two audiences simultaneously. They wrote and write not only for their fellow academics, but also for the general reading public. Now, this is something that is not easy to do, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do. Indeed, I believe that it is becoming almost impossible for academics to write simultaneously for these two audiences, their fellow academics and the general reading public. And that's the issue I want to talk about very briefly this evening. Now, over a half century ago, when I came of age, the great academic historians of the 1950s wrote naturally for both audiences, both for their fellow academics and for an educated general readership. I'm thinking of such academics in the 50s as those previous recipients of the Kennedy Medal, as Professors Morrison, Schlesinger Jr., Hanlon, and Morgan. But there were other academic historians with university appointments in the 1950s who also wrote for both sets of readers at the same time. And I'm thinking of people like Daniel Boorstin, C. Van Woodward, Alan Nevins, Richard Hofstadter, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., Arthur's father, Richard Morris, Eric Goldman, and Marcus Cunliffe all wrote. Their work was read simultaneously by academics and for the general readers. General readers read and enjoyed, say, Hofstadter's American Political Tradition, his Age of Reform, and at the same time, academic historians engaged likewise with Hofstadter's books. In fact, I recall being asked a question in my oral examination for my PhD about Hofstadter's argument in his Age of Reform. Most academic historians with university appointments, generally speaking, no longer write for two sets of readers simultaneously. And if they try to do so, their efforts are frowned upon and belittled. Such hybrid books have little currency in the academic world. They generally won't get you compliments or promotions from your academic colleagues. Consequently, academic historians now write almost exclusively for one another, and they focus on the issues and debates within the discipline. They're advancing the discipline. That's how they see their role. They usually don't think about readership that goes beyond the relatively few academic historians with whom they are involved in a conversation or a debate. Pauline Maier, a distinguished member of this society, is one of the few academic historians who does write for these two readerships simultaneously. A recent issue of the William and Mary Quarterly, which is the leading journal in our field, early American history, held a forum on her magnificent narrative history of the ratification of the United States Constitution. In this forum, several of her fellow academics criticized Maier for not mentioning Charles Beard and for not engaging in the academic debates over the origins of the Constitution, the debates that they're interested in, and she didn't deal with that. Reading Maier's response, one can almost, and it's in the William and Mary Quarterly, she responds to these critics. Reading her response, one can almost hear her sigh and see her shake her head in exasperation at the inability of her critics to understand what she was doing in writing a narrative history that would appeal not just to her fellow academics, but to a general reading public. Modern historians, she says, are not trained to write narrative. The discipline is more geared to asking questions and answering them, or proposing hypotheses and gathering evidence to support them, than to telling stories. None of the participants in the ratification debates that took place over 200 years, she politely points out, ever mentioned Charles Beard. Maier's critics might have appreciated her book more if they had heeded the warnings of Professor William Cronin, who is the current president of the American Historical Association. In a recent issue of the association's publication, Perspectives, Cronin told his academic colleagues that they were becoming much too inward, much too narrow. We have virtually become a guild, he said. We keep track of each other's work, compete with each other in complex status hierarchies, belong to social networks that require great efforts to join, and engage in critical dialogues that often grow more and more technical and self-referential the more vigorous and sometimes pedantic they become. Before long, Cronin went on to say, even colleagues with PhDs in other disciplines have no idea what we're talking about or why it matters. Worse still, he added, because history involves so many subfields dealing with so many times and places, even most of our colleagues in history share this confusion more than we're typically willing to admit. I had a colleague, actually, who once told me that when he wrote his book on 17th century Florence, he had only 3 or 4 readers in mind. And moreover, that these few, 3 or 4, would be the only ones who would understand what he was saying. I'm not sure he ever told his publisher that. Now, despite this limited readership, a great deal of academic history is being written. Historical monographs pour from the university presses, at least 1,200 or more a year, often on the most obscure and intimate topics. But often the sales of these monographs number only in the hundreds. And if it weren't for library purchases, their sales might be measured in the dozens. As a consequence, distinguished university presses are increasingly asking young authors for subventions of several $1,000s in order to publish their monographs. Now, some historians with university appointments who sell lots of books have always thought that it was their ability to write well that made them popular. Samuel Eliot Morison, a previous recipient of this prestigious award, and someone who did sell lots of books during the middle decades of the 20th century, certainly believed that. He thought it's writing well that counts. Academic historians, Morison said, have forgotten that there is an art of writing history. Instead of scintillating stories that move, they write dull, solid, valuable monographs that nobody reads outside the profession. Now that's true enough, but it is not, as Morison thought, that academic historians have forgotten how to tell a story. Instead, as Mayer points out, most of them have purposefully chosen not to tell stories, and instead have decided to write their dull, quasi-scientific monographs. So advising academic historians that they have to write more stimulating prose if they want to enlarge their readership misses the point. It is not heavy and difficult prose that limits their readers. It is rather the specialized and technical subjects they choose to write about and their conception of their readership as fellow historians, engaged in an accumulative science that relies on continual conversation and self-referential debate, argument. Since, like papers in physics or chemistry, the historical monographs focus on narrow subjects and build one upon another, the writers of these monographs presume that readers will have read the previous books on the same subject. That is to say, they will have possessed some prior specialized knowledge that will enable them to participate in the conversations and debates that historians have among themselves. In that sense, historians are beginning to act like physicists. No one expects a layman to enter into the conversations that physicists have with one another about their subject. And that's exactly what's happening, or has happened, to history. This is why most historical monographs are often inaccessible for general readers. New or innocent readers often have to educate themselves in historiography of the subject before they can begin to make sense of many of these monographs. I saw that very clearly. I was on the board of trustees of Colonial Williamsburg, and all of the trustees were given a copy of the William and Mary Quarterly, and most of those trustees were very interested in history, but they weren't experts, and they found it very difficult to read these articles because they weren't involved in the debate or the argument that was presumed on the part of the writers of these monographs. And to this extent, I think William Cronin, in his advice to his fellow academics to be less boring in their history writing, seems to have missed the point as well. It's not the fact that they don't write well that limits the academics to themselves. The problem at the present is that the monographs have become so numerous, so refined, and so specialized that most academic historians have tended to throw up their hands at the possibility of synthesizing all these studies, of bringing them together in some kind of comprehensive narrative. Now, 30 years ago, my teacher and a previous recipient of this distinguished award, Bud Balin, called attention to what he called the challenge of modern historiography, the need to bring some kind of narrative coherence out of all the proliferating monographs and technical studies. Alas, although Balin did his part in meeting the challenge with his book Voyages to the West, few academic historians have duplicated his effort to bring masses of monographs under control and to combine them in a narrative history that is accessible to a broad public. The result is that the reading public's desire for some sort of narrative coherence over the past generation has been increasingly met by non-academic historians who have no university appointments. We've always had popular historians such as Barbara Tuchman or Catherine Brinker-Bowen and Bruce Catton who wrote for a broad reading public. But never before have we had so many of these popular non-academic historians as we have now. Let's name a few, starting with David McCullough, the most celebrated of a growing number. I can think of 12, more or less off the top of my head, all of whom I've read with profit. Ron Chernow, Jay Winnick, Charles Mann, Walter Isaacson, Tom Fleming, John Meacham, Ian Toll, Richard Morton Smith, Stacy Schiff, Richard Brookhiser, David Stewart, Tony Horowitz, James Grant, Eric J. Dolan, Hugh Howard, Tommy Lester, John Barry, and Barnett Schechter. And there are many other popular historians like these who do not have PhDs in history and possess no academic appointments. They are not engaged in the conversations and the debates that academic historians have with one another. And they write their history not for academic historians, but for educated general readers interested in history. And unfortunately, they often write without much concern for or much knowledge of the extensive technical monographic literature that does exist. Now, this gap between popular and academic historians has probably existed since the beginning of the scientific history writing at the end of the 19th century. But never before has the writing of history in America seemed so bifurcated, so separated. Never before do we have so few academics writing for the general public and so many popular, non-academic historians fulfilling the popular need for history. Although Cronin refers to his fellow academic historians as professional historians, I have to believe that the popular historians, whom he calls the amateurs, are the real pros. They live solely by their pens, and they have no academic institutions to pay their salaries. I believe the challenge that Balin described 30 years ago has gotten so severe and so structurally based that it is now probably beyond being met by anyone. The monographs are too numerous, too diverse, too specialized, too technical, and too self-referential to be easily brought together into coherent narratives. And most academic historians have neither the ability nor the desire to write the kind of coherent narratives that Balin called for. We often hear of the biblical injunction that a house divided against itself cannot stand. We can only hope that in this case of history writing, the injunction proves to be false. Well, once again, I want to express my thanks to the Society for this wonderful award. I'm truly grateful. Thank you.